The title of my book, it sounds like a trendy diet, right? The endurance diet. I sort of came up with that title with a wink because it's really just a collection of habits. It's not something I came up with. It's just something that evolved naturally in the real world.
The Triathlon Show 153. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I'm back with Matt Fitzgerald, but this time to talk about his book The Endurance Diet, and not just the book of course, but the actual concept behind this nutritional approach. It's not really a diet, but actually a set of 5 core habits or principles that elite endurance athletes all over the world seem to follow. It's a bit like how, with the 80-20 training distribution that we talked about in last episode, it arose from investigating how elite endurance athletes really train and how they distribute their intensity. And the endurance diet, it's the same sort of research. Matt did a lot of investigations, both formal and informal, to discover the habits, nutritional approaches of the top endurance athletes of the world across disciplines, across continents. And he put together all of the findings in this book called The Endurance Diet. And the great thing is that us amateurs can use this very same approach and should use this very same approach if we want to optimize our endurance performance. And the Endurance Diet, this book, I read it a couple of years ago, I think, and this has been what I base my nutritional approach on ever since, really. And it works just brilliantly. I'm super happy about it. And it's of all the books that I read and all the things that you consume about nutrition in the endurance world, it really is, in my opinion, the best. I think it's just absolutely brilliant. So definitely listen to this interview, then get on Amazon. I'll link to it in the show notes and get this book. Just like you should get the 80-20 triathlon book, by the way. I think I didn't mention that in the last episode, that I actually do recommend getting that as well. So get on Amazon and go on a Matt Fitzgerald shopping spree while you're there. Before we dive into the interview, of course, as usual, let's thank our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. You know by now that the amount of sweat that individuals lose is very, very variable. But this is not the only thing that causes us to need to have individual hydration strategies. Within that sweat that we lose, some individuals lose a lot of sodium. A large concentration of their sodium concentration in their sweat is large, whereas some have much smaller concentrations of sodium. And typically normal sports drinks, although they do have sodium in them, but they are made for a minimal amount of sodium concentration in the sweat, and actually very few individuals are at that low sweat sodium concentration levels. So we need electrolytes, and it has been common wisdom for a long time in endurance sports that in long and hot racing in particular, people know that they should take some salt, but they just take some salt tablets at random without really considering how much, how many, and why. Precision Hydration makes it easy for you to tailor your hydration and your electrolyte strategy to your individual needs. You can take their free online sweat test on precisionhydration.com, and it's linked to in the episode description, and you'll get a very good estimate for how much sodium you need to consume in your hydration to make sure that hydration and the detrimental effects that lack of hydration and inadequate electrolytes can have on endurance performance don't happen to you. And cramping is one of those detrimental effects. So go and take that sweat test, and if you want to get your first box for free, then use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, on precisionhydration.com. And big thank you to Stack, the award-winning company that produces the Stack Zero bike power meters that have zero noise, zero wear and tear on the tire. check out all of their models, including the Stack Zero Base, the Stack Zero Power Meter, and the Stack Zero Halcyon Smart Trainer on their website, stackzero.com, and use the promo code TTS20 to get 20% off your own Stack bike trainer. I'm on a Stack Zero Power Meter as of this moment, but not at this moment. I'm actually recording in this moment, but that's my current bike trainer. But I have ordered and I'm waiting for the Stack Zero Halcyon, so I'll be very eager to test that out. And as you'll hear in a future episode as well, I will not review necessarily, I will talk with representatives from different software companies that make bike training software like TrainerRoad, Swift, Sufferfest, etc. And the Smart Trainer will allow me to test some of these softwares and utilize all of their functionalities. So I'm very much looking forward to that as well. But again, the URL is stackzero.com. That's STAC 0 spelled out, .com. And the promo code is TTS20 to get 20% off any of their models. All right, so with that said, let's get right into the interview with Matt Fitzgerald on the endurance diet. And we're back for another interview with Matt Fitzgerald, and this one will be on the endurance diet, which is the name of perhaps my favorite book of all the books that you've written that I read. I haven't read all of them, but a lot of them. So Matt, first, welcome back.
Great to be back.
Let's dive into the endurance diet and uncover what that really is. First, how did you go about researching and quote unquote finding this endurance diet?
Yeah, so I guess I've been paying attention to how elite endurance athletes eat since the 1990s. I remember writing an article for a magazine called Multisport. It was really a triathlon magazine about everything. It was actually just a long caption to a photograph. It was a photograph of everything that the then dominant professional triathlete Mike Pigg ate in a day, and it was an astounding amount of food. It was just all laid out on a table, and I didn't know. I was fresh out of college then. I didn't know the first thing about really nutrition, but that's when I started being exposed to how top professional athletes eat. And eventually I became a certified sports nutritionist. And as an athlete myself, I started to pay more attention to how I ate. And I've always tended to model both how I eat as an athlete and how I recommend other athletes eat. Model that on common patterns that I see among elite endurance athletes. They don't all eat exactly the same, but there are some consistent patterns, which I consider best practices. So the idea behind this book was to do some more formal or rigorous research into the habits that define the professional or elite way of eating for endurance performance. So I got to travel all over the world to eat with professional cross-country skiers, triathletes, runners, cyclists. But also, I also created because I couldn't travel everywhere, so I also created a survey that I would email to athletes in other places that I wasn't able to visit, and I gathered quite a large amount of data, and that's put it between the covers of this book.
And the final outcome of that was 5 core habits that you break down in individual chapters. And those are eat everything, eat quality, eat carb-centered, eat enough, and eat individually. So if we start with eat everything, what does that mean?
Yeah, there are a lot of popular diets out there that are based on forbidding certain food types. So there's as Americans pronounce it, paleo diet. We are not allowed to eat grains and dairy. There are vegetarian vegan diets where you can't eat animal foods. There's a no grain, no sugar diet out there. What I've found is that elite endurance athletes, they eat everything. There are no food types that they avoid. In fact, they tend to go out of their way to make sure they're including all of the natural food types in their diet, and they'll come up with some crazy concoctions, combining, foods that you would never think to put together just to make sure that they're not missing out on everything. And I think it helps them perform better because each food type is nutritionally distinct. And so if you have a well-rounded diet that includes some of everything, your health and fitness are less likely to be compromised by any gaps in nutrition.
And you mentioned there the word natural. So eat everything. Does that mean it's still, I guess, actually we come into that in the next point. So the next point and core habit is eat quality. So if you go into that and explain that as well.
Yes. So, eat everything doesn't mean eat equal amounts of everything. So, yes, everything does encompass, sweets, alcohol. I haven't encountered any professional endurance athletes who forbid themselves, like quote unquote unhealthy foods. In fact, it tends to be unhealthy to try to eliminate things like sweets because they're enjoyable and you're a human being. So as long as you're not eating too much of that stuff or drinking too much alcohol, it actually, I think most people find that they're just happier with a healthy diet if it's not all healthy. Nevertheless, the second habit is, as you said, eat quality, which means that most of what you're eating should be high quality or natural, unprocessed food types. That's all quality really means. That term, I'm a big proponent of it because nutritional scientists use it a lot, this concept of quality. Whereas in the mainstream discourse, it's all about carbs, fats, and protein, and they sort of ignore issues of quality, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and you have a great system, which is the diet quality score. Can you explain that a bit? Because I think that's just brilliant. I think it's probably the best way I've seen of tracking your diet, your nutrition, and it's not about counting calories or anything. It's just about tracking quality. So explain that.
Right. So when scientists do work in the field of nutritional epidemiology, which basically means they look for cause and effect patterns between how people eat, the foods they eat, and health outcomes like cancer risk or diabetes risk. They'll do that in large populations to answer questions such as, do people who eat more fruit tend to have lower rates of cancer, things like that. So to do that type of work, these scientists need ways of scoring diet quality. And so through just a lot of research of this type, scientists have tended to identify or been able to identify food types that are generally associated with positive health outcomes, and they're the obvious ones. They're basically, every natural food type is good for you in a certain amount. So up and down the line, from fruits and vegetables to nuts, to fish, to even dairy. Not all types of dairy, but things like yogurt and milk and cheese. Whereas things like sweets, excessive alcohol, fried foods, refined grains tend to be associated with negative health outcomes. So these scoring tools for diet quality already exist, but they're a little complex for everyday athletes to be able to use. So I just created my own, the diet quality score, that is more user friendly. So it's just intended to be a very simple way of putting a number on the overall quality of your diet. So there are tables in the book that show you how many points your second serving of fruit in a day gets. Or that type of thing. I also have a smartphone app that makes it very easy. So it's it takes a little bit of effort because but that's the point, is that you're paying attention to what you eat a little bit more than you would otherwise. We all tend to look through at our diet through rose-colored glasses, as they say, where you think your diet is better than it actually is, and when you use this tool, you're forced to see the reality of how you're eating, and then it makes it easier to kind of systematically improve the quality of your diet.
So if we run through the food groups, the high quality and the lower quality food groups, I think you have 10 groups. Is that correct? What are those groups from the highest quality to the lowest quality?
Yeah. So number one is vegetables. And I won't belabor. Who's going to argue with that anyway? Number 2 is fruit. Fruit and vegetables
some people will argue with fruit.
I know, but too bad. I mean, this is I didn't come up. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a scientist. I just this you have to read the book. There's a rationale for my ranking. That's all I can say, and it is scientific. So vegetables followed by fruit, followed by a category that I label nuts, seeds, and healthy oils, followed by dairy, followed by did I skip one? I think I might have skipped
whole grains, I think.
Yes, whole grains is ahead of dairy. Gosh, I've got the book in front of me now. And then unprocessed meat and seafood. And those are the high quality food types. The low quality food types are refined grains, sweets, and processed meat and fried foods. So that's 10.
Perfect. And the app is called, what is it called for people that want to download that?
DQS for Diet Quality Score. There's a version for iPhone and a version for Droids.
Got it. Yeah, and the book really goes into detail on those groups, so I highly recommend everybody go and get that book. And it's an easy read, but a great read and very scientifically sound. So the next habit then, eat carb-centered, which these days it's a bit controversial almost, but explain that.
Yeah. So, all I did was observe, and, I mentioned this in our earlier interview on 80-20 triathlon, which is that I'm a pragmatist. All I care about is what works. I don't come at, training from an ideological perspective or nutrition. And all I can say is what I have observed is that very nearly all elite endurance athletes across disciplines and on all inhabited continents eats a carbohydrate-centered diet. That doesn't mean it's, high carb all the time, but it means that high quality, high carbohydrate foods are included in most meals and snacks among this cohort. And, so that is why it's one of the 5 habits, just because it was a clear pattern that I observed everywhere I went.
And what kinds of carbs are the elite athletes eating? Because I think a common mistake, an assumption that people make is that they think that if you eat a high carb diet, then you eat tons of white pasta and bread and Kellogg's Frosties and that sort of thing. But that's not really the case, is it?
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of because low carbohydrate diets are very popular these days, both in the general population and among endurance athletes. And you'll see athletes go from sort of an anything goes diet where they're not even really thinking about what they eat except for that it tastes good, and then they'll go on a low carb diet and they'll lose weight and maybe have a good race, and they'll say, see, carbs are bad. But, they, what they've done is they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. That what I would suggest they do instead is, instead of getting rid of all the carbs, just get rid of the ones that elite athletes don't eat, which is, mostly the refined grains and the sweets, but retain the starchy vegetables, the whole grains, the fruit, even dairy. Because then you have the best of both worlds. You get the benefits of carbohydrate without the drawbacks of low quality food types, which just happen to be high in carbohydrate.
Then the next habit is eat enough. So go into that a little bit.
Yeah. So obviously it doesn't. It's not only what you eat that matters, but how much. And as an endurance athlete, you want to kind of thread the needle. You don't want to eat too little, and you don't want to eat too much. And what I've found is that elite endurance athletes, they do very, very little calorie counting. Because what happens is if you eat a diet that's based on high quality food types, those foods tend to be more satiating than low quality foods. So simply by shifting from a lower quality diet to a higher quality diet, you'll probably eat fewer calories, without counting calories, just by listening to your appetite, or kind of heating your appetite, because you'll just get fuller on fewer calories. But a certain amount of so just what I found is that just in general, elite athletes, one of the ways they tend to be a little different from the rest of us is that they're very tuned into their bodies, and that goes for being able to listen to their bodies in terms of their appetite and satiety as well. So we can all do that because every human infant is good at stopping a meal when they've had enough to eat. But we're sort of trained, especially in societies like mine in the United States, to sort of ignore those signals. Low quality food, doesn't help, but also just being bombarded with, billboards and television advertisements, and just too easy access to cheap and unhealthy food. It just makes us just eat even when we're not hungry. But the best way to thread that needle, to eat not too little, not too much, but the right amount, is to sort of eat intuitively, eat by feel, and just build habits around eating enough. Because most of us, we don't eat radically differently every day. So once you've sort of figured out how much is enough, you're doing more or less the same things every day, and then it becomes just it's just what you do. And people who are calorie counters, they tend to eat too little, which is very detrimental if you're an endurance athlete. And then as a consequence of eating too little, they eventually kind of snap and then binge and eat too much. So you might think you need to count calories to eat the right amount of food, but if you just look at the real world, the people who do the best job of it are the ones who don't count calories.
Yeah. I think that the point about calorie counting and eating too little, like especially among the very serious age groupers, I think some discussions that I've had, I think there's even some so far unpublished research, but that will be published from the Ironman World Championships in Kona from last year, about how something like 80% of the age groupers that were in the sample that was researched, they were in energy deficit, which is a very serious condition. It's not just that they're in a caloric deficit, but actually a severe. No, I'm looking for another term, not energy deficit, but can you help me, Matt? Do you know the term that I'm looking for?
What's that? Catabolism? Catabolic state?
No, it's energy availability, low energy availability, state of low energy availability. So that it depends, of course, on the size of the athlete, but usually it's quite a serious, like you just don't get the nutrients needed. So I think, especially at least from what I see in athletes around me that I coach and talk with and communicate with, the more serious the athlete gets, the more dangerous this it becomes, and the bigger the risk that an athlete actually starts kind of eating too little. Is that something that you see as well as a nutritionist?
Yes, and a point that I underscore a lot, because it's sort of counterintuitive. Again, in societies like mine, we're used to the idea that people tend to eat too much, so we don't give enough thought to what it means to eat too little. But as an endurance athlete, it's actually more harmful to eat too little, because if you eat too much as an endurance athlete, you will tend to train pretty well because you have enough energy. Energy comes from food calories. You'll tend to recover well because that takes raw materials that you get from food. The biggest downside of eating too much, and I'm not talking about radically too much, I'm just talking about a little too much. You'll be above your optimal racing weight when you get to the start line, which is not good, but you'll at least get to the start line. Whereas if you routinely eat not enough, you probably won't even make it to the start line. You'll be underfueled for workouts, so you won't feel good and you won't perform well in workouts. You won't recover as well because your body doesn't have the raw materials. You'll be more likely to get ill, more likely to develop overtraining symptoms, more likely to get injured. You really want to avoid making that error. And yes, it is very common to make that error because, endurance athlete, it's an undeniable fact that body weight and body composition are performance factors, so it does matter but you want to be very smart about how you go about regulating your food intake for the purpose of performance weight management.
Yeah. It's that old adage of better to be at the start line overweight and undertrained than overtrained and underweight.
Yes.
So finally, we have the fifth habit, which is eat individually.
Right. So the first four habits that we discussed are kind of universals. They establish a framework or a space that you want to operate inside of with your diet as an endurance athlete. But we're not all the same. Culturally, in terms of our personal history, our preferences, our values. So there's plenty of room, within the parameters established by those first four habits. There's plenty of room to eat in different ways. And I encourage, what I saw, the example I give in the book was I spent a few days in Spain with the Lotto Jumbo professional cycling team from the Netherlands. And it was, I think, 16 cyclists there, all eating their meals together. And, I would eat with them. And I remember noticing when I looked around at the table that no two plates had exactly the same food choices on them. So they all had the same options, but they all chose slightly different combinations. And when I went around the table asking athletes, why are you eating this and not that? They all had reasons for it. And sometimes it was just, I don't like that. But other times it was, that doesn't agree with me when I eat it or what have you. And so what some of the popular diets do is that they're one size fits all. It's like, this is how you eat if you're on the diet, and who cares what you like or don't like, or what you grew up eating, or what culture you're from. And I think that's a bunch of hogwash. I think that you should actually change your diet as little as necessary in order to get the results you want. Because presumably you eat the way you do for a reason. You like it, you're used to it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yes, you need to improve it to get better results, but it's okay to stick to your preferences. It's all about building habits, and you'll be more likely to stick to whatever habits you come up with if it just feels easy, because it's enjoyable, it's culturally relevant, etc.
Mm. So then another question that I wanted to ask is a bit the same as with the 80-20 training. How do we know, or what's the reasoning for why eating like the elites also applies to non-elite age group athletes?
Because we're all human is the short answer. I run into this all the time. People, it's really based on just a poor understanding of genetics. People almost seem to think, not everyone, but some people seem to think that elite endurance athletes are like a different species, but they're not. And genetic research has found that it's a very small number of genes that tend to make the elites different from the rest of us. And also, it's worth pointing out that as a cohort, elite athletes are as genetically different from each other as recreational athletes are different from each other. It's a mess. So basically, we're all human, and and the genes that do sort of are required, so the kind of must-have genes for elite performance, they have nothing to do with how food is digested and metabolized. So that's the genetic side. There's also the training volume side. So people might say, well, a triathlete who's training 30 hours per week, I trained 5 hours per week. So, but that's just a matter of scale. The same thing applies on training. We've discussed in a previous interview the 80-20 principle of intensity balance. So that applies whether you're a low volume recreational athlete or a high volume professional athlete. So training like the pros doesn't mean also doing 30 hours a week. Your body just might not be able to handle that. But so you still emulate their patterns, but with proper scaling. You do the same thing with diet. Because you are also human, you can, the best way, or the way the elites eat is also optimal for you, but with proper scaling. You don't need their 5,000 calories a day because you're not training 30 hours per week.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And then there are some other parts in the later chapters in the book beyond the core habits that are quite interesting and that I think we can discuss a little bit. And the first one is nutrition periodization.
Yeah, so I think most athletes are familiar with the concept of periodization in training, where you break the training process into phases, where you're not always emphasizing the same types of workouts, and you can do the same thing with nutrition. I don't like to see athletes overthink diet too much, because there are those who do, and it usually it's stressful and doesn't really get you where you want to go. But once you've started to practice these 5 habits and are reaping the benefits of doing so, there's still things you can do, refinements you can make to your diet to get even better results. And one of them is making changes in what and how you eat based on where you are in the training cycle. So or even whether it's if it's a rest day versus a heavy training day. So for example, if you're coming off an off-season break, so you've rested a little bit, your training volume has gone way down, you've gained a little bit of weight, which is perfectly appropriate at that time. As you look to go into the next training cycle, you might want to do sort of a short weight loss focus phase. And the best way to eat for fast weight loss is not the same as the endurance diet. It's not the same as the best way to eat for building fitness. So you might just set aside a few weeks to eat in a way that helps you shed those 2 or 3 kilos you gained during your break, and then shift back to the patterns that you'll use, the endurance diet habits that you'll use as you focus on building your fitness for competition again.
Yeah, great overview. So we have periodization both in the more macro scale, like coming back from the off season, but also, as you mentioned, easier days versus harder training days. That it's not a static thing in nutrition. You don't eat the same every single day. It's not just scaling, but even what you eat can change a bit. So we don't need to dive deeper into that, but I think this is a very interesting concept, and that's explained well in the book, so the listeners can check that out. And I think it's something that's often overlooked as well, because we want, as a society, a hard and fast answer to everything, and that's why we see these diets come up, and people want to know exactly what macronutrients they should be eating and should not be eating. But that can change and should change with the time of season and the time in the training microcycle as well.
Right, exactly.
So what about fueling workouts? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so a workout is not a race. So when if you're going to do a race, you want to have a very precise plan. You want to do what works. What's known to work best, because you're fighting for every second, presumably. Workouts kind of run the gamut. From just short, easy recovery sessions to very hard workouts that are almost as hard as a race, almost as challenging. So for longer, harder sessions, the ones that start to look a little bit more like races, nutrition consumed during those sessions starts to matter, because you're going for performance. So the big ones are fluid for hydration and carbohydrate for fuel as an energy, an exogenous energy source. So it's best to know exactly what the rules are for races, and then you can understand what you might want to do in workouts without you don't have to be as uptight about getting everything perfect in a harder workout, but still you want to take advantage of the performance boosting effects of hydrating and fueling during workouts. The wrinkle is that there are some workouts where you might want to intentionally withhold supplemental energy, carbohydrate in particular. It's sort of like altitude training, where you train at high altitude because it's harder. You also might want to withhold calories during some workouts precisely because it's an added stress to your body, and it may respond to it by getting a stronger fitness boosting stimulus from the session.
Yeah, and that's so those. What about fueling before those fasted workouts? Is that something that you would recommend doing, like having an overnight fast and then going up in the morning and training and withholding fuel, or even potentially having a hard workout in the morning and then a second workout that you train low in the afternoon? What if we dive deeper into that training low concept?
Yeah, that's the most practical way to do it, and it's the way I see it done. This is an area where some of the studies, they're interesting and they're compelling. Studies where they look at different fasted training protocols, but some of them are things you would never want to do in the real world as an athlete. Hard interval sessions 4 days in a row. It's important to understand the difference between a study that is designed in order to highlight differences and then something that you would actually do as part of your routine in the real world as an athlete. So, because you presumably you sleep at night and you're not eating while you're sleeping, it just makes sense if you want to do a depleted training session to do it first thing in the morning, where you're already fasted and you don't have to just because when you're asleep you're not hungry. Get that session done and then go ahead and chow down.
Yeah. I, as a coach, I have prescribed those training low sessions in the afternoon or evening after a hard workout in the morning with little or no carb refueling in between those sessions, and I've seen very good results for some of my more advanced long distance athletes, whether it's Ironman or long cycling races with that protocol, because some of the studies seem to indicate, as you said, that maybe you are a little bit more depleted than after just an overnight fast. But you're absolutely right that for practical reasons, that first option might be the best and the one that's available to the most athletes and potentially get the most of the bang for the buck, so to say.
It's interesting to know that you've done that, though. So, that's good. It's an interesting area because people are, serious-minded people are experimenting and trying things. So I'm like a sponge, trying to.
I think one of the first cases where I tested it was with an athlete. He might be listening to this, Nikita, who did a long road cycling race. It was 227 kilometers in the Austrian Alps. Actually ventured into Italy, I think, as well, with something like 5,000 plus meters of elevation gain, which would be, I guess, over 15,000 feet. And so a very long day out. And
wow.
So the finishing time was for this athlete, who was a very good cyclist, was still something like 11 hours. 11 hours in that ballpark anyway. So for that long a day, of course, like maximizing fat burning is very important. And he managed to. The great thing about his performance was that he really stayed strong and didn't drop off in performance even as the day approached 11 hours long. So, of course, it's not all attributable to one single protocol that we did, but we did that very consistently every week in the last few weeks, except taper leading up to the race for a couple of months, I think, almost. So I think it was good, and I also do that with some more advanced Ironman athletes. So I'm interested to get more data from my personal stable of athletes as well on how that works.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Then the final thing to talk about in beyond the core habits would be supplements.
Yes. So, again, I mentioned before that I'm very pragmatic in my orientation to performance nutrition, not ideological. So, there tend to be two camps on supplements, like either they're all good or they're all bad, or, thumbs up or thumbs down. But, I believe in evaluating supplements individually, just based on, their merits, their proven merits or lack thereof. What I have found is that, there doesn't seem to be any sort of must-have or must-take supplement for endurance athletes as a performance enhancer. sort of like, the way I phrase it sometimes is that what creatine is to strength sports, there doesn't seem to be any real obvious equivalent in endurance sports, but the supplements that do tend to be sort of close to necessary, or that you see a lot of the elite athletes taking consistently, are ones that are more for health than for performance enhancement. And the big three would be omega-3 essential fats, which it's right in the name. They are essential to human health, and it can be difficult to consistently get enough of them, especially if you don't have a seafood heavy diet. So that's one. That is one that I take myself every day, even though I do eat a lot of seafood. Number two, which is it's not universally necessary, but often conditionally so, is iron. A lot of endurance athletes are iron deficient, especially runners and triathletes who do a lot of running. So it's important to sort of track your iron levels on a regular basis, or at least consider low iron as a possible culprit if you're suffering from a lot of fatigue that doesn't have another obvious explanation, and supplement if necessary. I actually discovered, to my embarrassment, that I was low on iron last year. Even a sports nutritionist, and I was low. I started supplementing. I got tested because I was planning to spend 13 weeks at high altitude. And if I had gone there low, the altitude camp would have been a disaster for me. And then the other one that a lot of athletes need for health, but there's no health and fitness obviously overlap, is vitamin D. It's a common deficiency. The symptoms can look a lot like iron deficiency, fatigue being the main one. So people, especially in the winter, people with darker skin are very commonly deficient. Sometimes just seasonally so. So it's good to track your vitamin D levels too, and also supplement if necessary.
Right, got it. Great overview. So finally, a listener question. This one is from Andrew, and that's it would be good to get your view on trendy diets. So can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the title of my book, it sounds like a trendy diet, right? The endurance diet. I sort of came up with that title with a wink, because it's really just a collection of habits. It's not something I came up with. It's just something that evolved naturally in the real world. And I think it's just, because it does have built-in flexibility, it's not really a diet in that sense too. You can find a Kenyan runner and a Canadian cross-country skier who are both on what I would call the endurance diet, but if you just look at what's on their dinner plates, there's no resemblance. So I just think it's the way to go, because it's the same way this 80-20 training method evolved, which is it evolved in the real world through trial and error, like generations of athletes trying to perform at the highest level, just sort of slowly figured out, not scientifically, but just by training and competing, like which methods tended to work best and which didn't. It's just not accidental. And the same thing on the diet side, where it wasn't a scientist that came up with this. It's not. I didn't come up with it for the purpose of this book. It's just something that happened in the real world without anyone. The blind watchmaker analogy. Just no one was in charge. It just sort of happened, but it happened for a reason. It's what tends to work best. Whereas these fad diets, most of them, they weren't even created for endurance athletes. Ketogenic diets were not created for endurance athletes, but because they existed, you have endurance athletes try them. But I just don't think it's a sensible starting point. If I had an athlete come to me and I knew absolutely nothing about him or her, I wouldn't just automatically put that person on a vegan diet or a low carb diet or anything. I would say, well, this is what seems to work best consistently in the real world. So let's start there.
Yeah, and what you mentioned earlier with people that switch to any sort of diet, really, what they go from an anything goes approach to then actually having a strict set of rules, which automatically makes their diet higher quality. But in this approach to nutrition, to avoid the word diet, you do need to have quality. So it's not an anything goes approach. It's a quality focused approach. So I think that really does answer the question. Or it's of course something that we could talk about for hours and hours. And you have another book about that, which is called "Is Diet Cults?" or
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So that wraps it up for this interview. We already did the rapid fire questions last week's interview. So thanks again, Matt. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you.
So again, I hope that you enjoyed that interview. And the main takeaways for me, I want to reiterate what the core habits are, first of all. There are 5 of them, and they are: eat everything, eat quality, eat carb-centered, eat enough, and eat individually. And if you want to, definitely go back and rewind this episode, listen to all of those parts again to learn what really went into each of those core habits. So as you can see, it's very flexible. You can have a very different nutritional not approach, but you can have very different things on your plate compared to your next door neighbor who is also a triathlete, and compared to the Japanese triathlete that you are friends with on Facebook. But still, you can both be following these same core principles. Matt used that example of the Canadian cross-country skier versus the Kenyan runner, and they will definitely have very different foods that they eat, very different looking plates, but they all follow these strategies. We also, another key takeaway, if I move on to my next point here that I noted down, is that even though the book is called The Endurance Diet, it's not a quote-unquote trendy diet. It's an approach, a flexible system around some cornerstone habits. And again, it all comes down to the fact that it doesn't tell you what to put on your plate and what not to put on your plate. As long as you follow the cornerstone habit, you can still adhere to this same nutritional approach and follow all these core habits. And finally, to answer the question again that we already went into, why would you like to eat as an elite athlete? Well, because we're all human, and to eat like an elite means that we're optimizing for health first, because you can't perform if you're not healthy. That's a given. Secondary, we're optimizing for performance, and that is, I think, a lot of athletes, I think now, are getting around to health consciousness. At least around me, I see it, more and more people are eating actually healthy. But a lot of people do not know how to optimize for performance. And I think that this book will explain it very easily for you, how to optimize your nutrition for performance. And finally, when you have optimized for health and for performance by following these habits, there are those more advanced concepts that we also went into a bit, so that you can fine-tune and get those more marginal gains out of your performance. And that includes things like nutrition periodization, train low strategies, etc. And of course, if you want to get a reminder of what we talked about here, you have the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com, and you can leave comments or questions about this episode in the comments section on that show notes page. In the next episode, as I already teased a little bit in last week's episode, I will interview Arild Tveiten, who is the head coach of the Norwegian triathlon team, which has made a real, not overnight success, but because that doesn't happen in endurance sports. But they have burst onto the scene, and they did a podium sweep in April in Bermuda in the WTS World Triathlon Series event, and that has never happened. None of the triathlon superpowers like the United Kingdom, the United States, Spain, any of those, none of them have ever done a podium sweep. And then the little country of Norway comes and does this almost out of nowhere, although Christian Blumenfeld has been a very, very strong performer in the last few years. But it was, to many, a big surprise, including myself. But that is a brilliant episode that you cannot miss if you're interested in training for performance. And it doesn't matter that it's about how the elites train. I think these concepts that we talk about with Adil, they are very much applicable for age group athletes. That's where Adil got his start. He started coaching age group athletes and then eventually ended up becoming the head coach of the Norwegian national team. So that's next week. Make sure that you don't miss it, and you can do that by subscribing to the podcast. That really helps. It also helps me reach my goal. I have a new podcast goal, and that is to get 50,000 monthly downloads before the end of this year, 2018. So if you subscribe, that definitely helps, because then you don't miss episodes as they come out. And another thing that I would really want you to do is to leave a rating and review on iTunes, because those really do help people find the podcast, because it goes up in the rankings. Big thank you to username ARG I hate this. Hopefully it's not about this podcast. It doesn't seem to be. From the United States, who writes, excellent resource, 5 stars. I'm not a triathlete. However, the content of this podcast has been a great benefit to me as an endurance athlete. I'm a competitive rower. The episodes on interval training were excellent, as well as the one on Steven Seiler's training pyramid. I also enjoy the triathlon-focused episodes to the point that I'm considering working on my swimming this winter so I can give it a try. Finally, Michael's preparation and effort to provide a quality podcast experience is apparent in the well-organized discussion and great sound quality. Thank you very much, I hate this. That really means a lot to me. And anybody who has been a long-time listener but haven't yet left a rating and review, please do so. And another thing that you can do to help is, if you can tell just one friend about the podcast, then there are a lot of listeners already. So if everybody tells one friend about the podcast, then that does a lot for the podcast and in terms of helping me reach my goal as well. Big thanks to our sponsors, Stack, that you can find on stackzero.com. That's where you can go and you should buy their quality bike trainers. If you're looking for a new bike trainer for this winter, then this is where you should look. DC Rainmaker has a great hands-on with the Stack Zero Halcyon that you can check out if you are familiar with DC Rainmaker. He's the gear guru in the triathlon world. A great site, so go and check that out. And he's overwhelmingly positive in that review. Eurobike award, the best bike training accessory, went to the Stack Zero Halcyon as well. So this is a top of class bike trainer. Check it out. And for any of their trainer models, you can use the promo code TTS20 to get 20% off on stackzero.com. And a big thank you to Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test to get your individualized hydration and electrolyte strategy. And if you haven't already ordered from Precision Hydration, you can try them out for free. Get your first box for absolutely nothing with the promo code That's Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.